Thanks, Johnny, and thank you very much, everyone who's been organizing this series. I think it's a great idea. When I saw this come around for the first time, I thought I really would like to be part of this. So thankfully, it's come to pass for me now. Thanks for having me, like I said. And this talk is something I have previously done at UK or UG last year. So it's a pretty fresh talk to me. And I did, like I said, I presented this to a live audience in December. But since live audiences seem to be a far, far distant memory, I'm very glad that I got the opportunity to present this to a virtual audience. So I have been trying to make the font sizes suitable for this audience. So it's not too small, not too big. And it all fits on the screen, and we tested this yesterday, and hopefully it's good enough. But should somebody find out that viewing this presentation, the fonts don't quite work out, you should know that I'm going to make the slides available, and from then on it shouldn't be a problem at all. What I've also decided on doing is I'm going to look at the questions at the end, because it's pretty tricky otherwise to keep going with the presentation. So keep the questions coming, please. Ideally, if you have a question specific to a slide, please enter the slide into the question as well, and I'm going to jump back to the relevant part of the presentation. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So for those of you who haven't had any of my presentation seen so far, I'd like to quickly say who I am. My name is Martin Bach. I work for Accenture Architect Group in Germany, and I'm an used a fair bit of time. What I'm going to cover in this presentation is the static listener registration, which has changed in the way we work with DataGuard. I'm also going to cover the switchover readiness check, if that's something you haven't seen yet. It's a real-time saver. I'm going to talk about delayed redo application, which I have seen some customers use to prevent corruption. And I'm also going to mention a number of ways to survive no logging operations. I'm going to show you the price for asynchronous redo shipping. And another new feature that has come in is the use of DBCA to create a physical standby. So let's just repeat what I just said before. Everything I say reflects my opinion and only mine. And I haven't really paid any attention to licensing. So whatever you do in following this presentation, just make sure you're licensed to do that. But you can safely assume you need at least Database Enterprise Edition and potentially quite a few options on top of that. So having said that, in the interest of time, I'm going to start off with the listener. And so there were quite a few people I know that are still on 11G. And in this scenario, you'd had to statically register your DataGuard configuration with the listener. Otherwise, your switchover operations would have failed. So that is a bit tedious, especially if you think about multi-node databases like rack systems and rack 1. So there is, thankfully, in 12.1, there is a better way of doing this. So this is an excerpt from the Oracle documentation that I have seen in 12.1, and in 12.1 the highlighted part is mine here. A static service needs to be defined and registered only if Oracle Clusterware or Oracle Restart is not being used. So that means you only need this in case you're using single instance without any trace of Clusterware being present. Okay, so if you don't have Clusterware being present, then you have to follow this thread here. You see in a gray box what you need to enter into the listener.ora file. Okay, so the static listener registration is a thing of the past, provided you use Oracle Restart or RAC, and especially in the cloud, we see lots of Oracle Restart simply because of the ability to use ASM for multiple block devices that you can aggregate into a disk group. So what does it mean? It just makes role transitions a lot easier. Because you no longer have to really worry about the former standby database coming up as the primary. So that's a good thing. Here you see an example on the right-hand side. It's using two of my systems. I always call them by location. One of the observations that I have made is if you call your database prod and standby, and you operate your standby database
in primary role, people find it very confusing to connect to the standby database, and you get lots of questions potentially as a DBA if that happens. So if you set a DB unique name to the location where your database is, site A, site B, DCA, DCB, whatever, then it becomes a lot less confusing for people. So here in my case, I've got site A, which is primary, and site B, physical standby database, and I'm using the broker to switch over to site B. And you can see down here in green, you can see that Oracle Clusterware is restarting database site A, and it'll be restarted as a physical standby in that case. So that is really cool. However, you still need the static listener registration if you're using single instance Oracle. So you need to make sure that you register your DB unique name .db domain in the listeners, and you need to do that in every listener. So you need to do that in the primary databases and the standbys, or every single database in your data configuration. Otherwise, you perform a role reversal such as switchover, and it's really unpleasant if your standby database doesn't come up. And it's not a problem. It's just that you get a listener who doesn't know about the service name in Connect Descriptor, so you have to manually get back in. But then your data guard config with the broker is potentially out of sync, and that's not, it's not what you want really when it's a heated enough situation anyway. But I'm going to show you how you can validate whether the static listener registration is actually working. And that's possible since 18C. Okay, so validating is the next keyword that I wanted to discuss a little bit. So when you think about switchover operations, they can certainly be nerve-wracking, and they don't really need to be. And why are they nerve-wracking? It's usually a question about how often do you do these. A lot of people I know, and as one of my first talks at a user group, I saw somebody who talked about problems with archive logs and how they copied archive logs from the standby over to the primary to get it going again and so on. But they just copied files from the standby rather than switching over to the standby. I think that was because they haven't really had enough time to practice, maybe. I don't know. But switchovers are something that are quite natural, and they can become second nature, but it requires you to actually do this every now and then. And in order to prepare for this, I connected to the primary, I connected to the standby, I ran all sorts of scripts to make sure that my environment is actually in sync. I have no transport lag, I've got no apply lag, MRP0 is still running, and I can actually switch over. And that was quite tense. And you never knew, did I test for everything or did I just miss something? So when I saw the validate command come in 12.1, I thought this is super awesome. And if you haven't seen this yet, there is the help validate command. This is from a 19C database that I just did, and it just shows you what you can do. So here you've got validate database, which has existed for a long time, but then you've got validate database verbose, you've got the SP file, the data file validation. If you're using file sync, that's also something you can check. And the network configuration is very useful check here as well. And what I'm going to show you later on is the static connect identifier for the database. So I personally would advocate or put forward the case of doing regular switchovers, especially if you have a requirement to patch your systems every now and then. Some people do this quarterly, some do it twice a year. And if your patch is standby first applicable, then it might actually be a good test to make sure that you can switch over and switch back and run your applications from both from both sides. Usually you've got two. And that's why, so that would be a good opportunity to rehearse all these switchovers. And then, of course, it's very important to have the entire procedure documented so that you don't have to really think. You can just follow a procedure, and it works. So in 12.1, like I said, we have the validate command being introduced, so it's a lot better. So we can do a lot of these checks quite easily. Now let me show you a few of those. The first one is validate database, and I think this is really, really good. And it doesn't matter whether you do this for a RAC, an Oracle restart, or a single instance database. It's just checking so many things with a single command. It's great. So what does it check, for instance? Do you have standby redo logs present? Do you have flashback database enabled? And that can become really important when you have to actually fail over to your standby database. And it's also checking whether your system is managed by clusterware. So if you say, for example, you have created your standby database using RMAN duplicate for standby, and if somehow the process was manually executed and you didn't register the database with Oracle Restart, it would now tell you. And very crucially is the network configuration okay? So after role reversals and switchovers and such, can you actually receive data? Will log shipping still work? Because that's probably very, very important. Now let me show you a few examples of validate database. So we've got validate database and then the database name as it exists in the broker, and it tells me, now remember that I just switched over from site A to site B, so I'm now running primary database from site B, and I can check the status of site A. So it tells me it's a physical standby, and the database name, it's ready for switchover, and it's ready for failover as well. It tells me I don't have flashback database enabled, and it tells me it's managed by clusterware, and a few other stats about the log files which have been cleared or not. So why does that matter? It matters if you've got really large log files and you need to clear them before using them. It can take a little while, depending on your storage option. So what else do we have? So if you say validate database verbose, so you add the verbose keyword to the command, you can see a lot more detailed information, and it's the one that I usually use before doing a switchover. So again, this is the same situation. It's a physical standby. My primary is site B. I'm ready for switchover. Everything is the same, except that I'm now being told it's a single instance database because I've got one instance, one thread. Do I have all the temp files is something that it tells me as well. Is there an online data file move in progress? What's my apply related settings? Do I have an apply or a transport lag? No, I don't. It looks good. And it also tells me about the log files. So here it's something I'm going to show you in the next slide. This is where I had problems with this output where it said insufficient SRLs. But in my case, I've got 3 online redo log groups on my primary, and I've got 3+1 on my standby. So I've got sufficient standby redo logs, SRLs. And the future is also the reverse of this previous. So when I reverse roles, will my then standby have enough standby redo logs? And yes, it does. And it also compares, and that's also very important. It compares the sizes of the online redo logs. So sometimes when we go and do and look at systems, we find that some log files are in a different size compared to others, and this is a way to verify they're all the same. And then you get a few other things such as apply-related properties, which I'm not going to go in great detail. So the important thing here is maybe the log transfer mode, log XPT modes, both are in sync. So you can see that even after role reversal, I wouldn't run into problems with my protection mode. I usually run max availability and synchronous redo transport for a good compromise between availability and data integrity. But that's obviously a decision that has to be made for every single system. So, but my starting point would be max availability, and the rest is just the defaults that the broker assigns. And having spoken about the broker a little bit here, my favorite use of the data guard technology is by means of the broker, since it offers so many advantages over using the SQL Plus command line interface or the SQL CL command line interface. You don't have to memorize commands. They're usually short and succinct, and the broker takes care of a great many things that you would otherwise have to type in manually. So I remember I was a bit skeptical of the broker when it came out in, when I had first contact with it in Oracle 9i, but that was completely unfounded. The broker is one of the greatest things there is. And if nothing else, it also allows you to integrate your data card configuration into OEM monitoring. So that doesn't work without the broker, or it didn't work until without the broker when I used it last. So really no reason for me not to use the data card broker. Okay, so then we had the insufficient SRLs. Why might you get this? So if you run the command validate database verbose, it may sometimes tell you you've got insufficient SRLs. And this is a peculiarity that I have had in up to 19.3. I haven't tested since. But when you create standby redo logs and you don't specify the thread you need to assign them to, and in single instance, there is obviously only one thread, so which other than the first thread should it be? It creates the standby redo log with thread 0, as you can see down here. Groups 3 and 4, they are of thread 0. And when the broker validation happens, it just finds out that, oh, I've only got 2 standby redo logs for thread 1. So obviously it's not enough because I need 4, because it's 3 plus 1. Yeah, so that's something I think, yeah, there was a blog post where I found this to be said, but it's something that I found so important that I wanted to mention it here as well. So always specify a thread number when creating standby redo logs. I mean, you do it anyway with rack, so I think it just should become second nature when you do this with single instance deployments as well. Okay, so then assuming that you're not using clusterware for your standby database configuration, your data guard configuration, I said previously it's important to statically register the so-called static connect identifier with the listener. So in here you can say validate network configuration for all. So this is where I was connected. I think I was connected to site A at that point in the broker. Typed in validate network configuration for all, and what does it do at that point? So it connects to site A from site A, works. It connects to site B from site A, and it does the inverse. So it makes sure that it can just ship redo, essentially. That's the normal, regular connectivity for redo transports. But it also does something else. So you can read here, Oracle clusterware is not configured on database site A. Then it tries to use the static connect identifier. This is a property of your broker configuration. By default, this is what it is. You know, some people have specific needs to send this via a different route, but in my case, I've got one network interface. I'm sending data guard traffic over that network interface, and it just tries to connect to site A DGMGRL, and it does so, and it then tells you, oh, I'm not able to do so using this connection string. It doesn't know of the service request and connect descriptor. Likewise, it also tries to do the same thing, connecting to database site B using the static connect identifier, and guess what? That doesn't work either. So why is that not the case? Because the static listener registration is missing. Okay, so not good. So what do you need to do in that case? You look at the listener aura file. Because this is not using clusterware, the listener runs out of my database home, and it's the standard OFA path to the listener.aura file. So what I just did, I added a listener description, and the thing that you will never remember to type off at the top of your head is the sitlist listener, sitlist underscore listener name. So in my case, the listener is called listener, and it's got a sit list, and I need to set the global DB name equals site A DGMGRL, which is the same as you can see here being referenced. And obviously, you need to do the same thing on your other hosts in your data guard configuration. So just make sure that your SIP name, global DB name, and Oracle home are specified. This allows the broker in a configuration where clusterware isn't being used to restart your database. Otherwise, it won't be able to. So once you've done this, you need to reload the listener. And you can then see that here down in green, the service site A DGMGRL has one instance pointing to the instance site A. And any statically registered service is always in status unknown, so there's nothing to worry about. That's just how it's being displayed. And with that said, I can revalidate my network configuration. And you can see in green there it all succeeds now because I have the relevant service names configured in listener.aura. So wonderful, all is good. The next thing I wanted to talk about is protecting against logical corruption. There are cases out there where you can have a third standby database to protect you from logical corruption. What might that be? So say for instance, you've got a software bug, a developer doing something wrong, a batch job that hasn't worked out right, or a software release that didn't quite do the things it should have been doing. And it sometimes happens. It's rare, but it does happen. And this corrupts your data in some way. Maybe a where clause was missing on a data migration script, and now you've deleted too much data, and it would take forever to get it back. And maybe this happened not just across one table, but multiple tables. So you're in a situation where you need to really assess your options. And one approach I have seen people use is delayed redo application. Why might that help? Because if you've got modern networks and you're replicating your data in real time to your standby database, the logical corruption will be in place by the time you realize, oops, the script didn't do what I wanted it to do. So in that case, you need to think about options. And there are some people who think about adding another standby to the configuration, and it's really rare. I haven't really seen more than a handful of sites where this has happened. Because most people just stick to one primary and one standby. So in my case here, I've got a configuration in the broker, which is comprised of two databases, site A and site B. And this is the same I had just before. And I'm just adding a delay, a new database. I call it delay because I'm not very creative, and I enable it. So my configuration now consists of three databases that you can see. And by default, there is no delay in redo apply. So I can now set my database to, I can set the property delay minutes to 30, which would be 30 minutes. And now if I query my configuration a little later, it says the apply lag has exceeded the specified threshold, which is kind of, yeah, I know, because I just told you to lag behind. So hopefully 30 is just a random number because I could have taken 42. Anything that allows you to detect a problem before it's applied. And when I've initially used this feature, I thought, okay, so there is a commit now on my primary database, and 30 minutes later, this commit will also make it to my standby database with a delay threshold of 30 minutes. But it's not the case. And I just wanted to point that out because it can be misleading. Looking at the alert log and network traffic, I could definitely see that things are different. And so there is the process, as I've been able to work it out with 18.5, but I suppose it's the same everywhere. You've got the RFS process on your standby database waiting for redo and waiting to write it into the standby redo log. The archiver process is waiting and eventually receive the archived standby redo log. Then you've got a recovery slave, and that's the name of the process. I didn't assign that. Waits for delay minutes and then applies the log. Okay, so if you look at this closely, you can already see that there is maybe more delay to this than initially thought about, because the delay is actually the time between archiving the standby redo log and applying it. It's not the time between the commit and redo application. The actual apply lag is shown by the broker and $DataGuard stats. And from what I looked at, it's possible and most likely to have more than delay minutes of delayed redo application. So how can you get this in check? How can you force redo to be transmitted at a regular interval? You can use archive lag target. That's something I've used in 9i days to make sure that a redo log switch happens every whatever value you set to archive lag targets. But it seems that even I forgot it, so I haven't used it since we all use standby redo logs and real-time apply, right? So why would you care about this parameter? It might come in handy though. So now if you look at the alert log, this is from my standby database, and we're here now waiting for thread 1 sequence 331, which is the log which is supposed to arrive at some point. It's now in transit. And this is at 20:30, so it's 8:30 when that happens. Now it tells you a little bit of housekeeping information, what it does with it, and eventually the archive log arrives. And this is at 20:48, so it's taken 18 minutes for the archive log to arrive, or all the data pertaining to that archive log to arrive on the standby database. And so this is 18 minutes already. And now is the time where the counter starts. At 20:48, the counter starts, and it tells you, okay, so the archive log will be available in 30 minutes. And it then goes and says, yeah, I delayed it for 30 minutes and now applying it. And that's at 21:18. So the 30 minutes is really the time between the archive log arriving and it being applied in your database. So in my case, it is not a delay of 30 minutes. In fact, this is a delay of 48 minutes. Just something to be aware of. Another thing to be aware of is the recovery from failure. And sometimes things go wrong, and what's good about the database is that fixing things gets easier with every release. So, for example, there is a no-logging operation, which shouldn't be an issue in the first place because your primary database probably should be running in forced logging. Well, there are, of course, exceptions, but most of the operational systems probably should be running with forced logging on, so as to prevent this problem in the first place. But now assume it's not using forced logging, it's an archive log mode, no flashback logging. Someone performs a no-logging operation, which will corrupt the data on the standby. Hooray! Now you have to take action. So here's an example. I'm creating a table I call corrupted, again, because I'm not very creative in naming things. And it's I say this is now created as no logging, as select star from somewhere. And I can check forced logging is off, flashback is off, and if I run an RMAN report unrecoverable, yeah, guess what? There is now a full backup required of this data file. And what happens if I open my standby read only? I do this, and obviously query from the table, and it tells me, oh, data block so-and-so is corrupted on my data file. So that's not good. I can look into $non-logged block, and I see that file 7, block 347 onwards, I've got 1,480 blocks that aren't really good, pertaining to objects 73566, which is my table I just created. And now there is the magic. I can now say recover database non-logged block, and it does it. And when it's really very little data to be done, but you can see it takes like a second only to recover it. And if I look into the alert log, it tells me what it does. It's very kind, and I can see the blocks have been reported, being recovered, and so the operation finishes. And once I'm still not connected to my physical standby, I can run select count star from Martin corrupted, and I get all the data that I have previously not being able to see due to the block corruption there. So just one example of how to do this. And now that you've been sweating a little and felt a bit uncomfortable, probably I would have, it's time to think about enabling forced logging on your database. Okay, so another thing I wanted to talk to you about is the price you pay for synchronous redo. And obviously, redo transport works by means of using networks, and even if you want to, it's impossible to send data across a wire faster than the laws of physics permit. Okay, so I have read a white paper from Oracle where they say synchronous redo transfer really requires your round trip times, requires a network to have a round trip time of 5 milliseconds and less. And while that would make every multiplayer happy, like a ping time of 5 milliseconds, that's really a long time for use in the database world. So it's a bit tricky if you want to go from a max performance protection mode to maximum availability or maximum protection, because they really require you to use synchronous redo transport. So why is that a problem? It is a problem because the transaction won't commit until redo is written to the standby in that mode. And I've now done a little test just to demonstrate how this works, and I did this by using 12.201, so it's a little older but still valid. And I've got two runs of a tool that I created. No, it's not my tool, it's Swingbench. I was running Swingbench, sorry. One with DataGuard and synchronous redo transports. And since I don't have the luxury of having systems miles and miles apart, I needed to do some software changes to introduce 100 millisecond latency, which is ridiculous, but it demonstrates the effect quite nicely. So I did run the SOE order entry for 30 minutes, and that's what you can see on the right-hand side. This is the ideal network. This is my baseline. And so what can you see? You can see on OEM's performance pages that performance at that point in time is actually acceptable. So wouldn't really complain too much about it. This is what it probably would look like with without DataGuard as well. So okay, that looks good. Now I'm going to use synchronous redo transport and the bad network. So I'm changing the log XPT mode to sync, and I'm going to change the protection mode to max availability just to make sure that it's all in place. And then I'm using TC-QDisk and NetEM functionality to increase the network latency. And I run the same benchmark again that I have been doing. And so the first thing I do is using AshTop, which is an excellent tool by Tanel Potter, looking at $active session history. So obviously you would require the diagnostics pack for that. But you can see that on my system, the session state background, so these are the background processes, it really is waiting for redo transport, MISC, and sync remote write. So these are the two waits that it's waiting for. And you can see that immediately here as well on the OEM performance pages, for which also you would, of course, require specific licenses. And you can see that I've got way more active average sessions. And if I look at top sessions, it's logwriter and NSS2. So those, if you remember those guys here, logwriter and NSS2, they have 293 samples and 286 samples respectively, and just one AAS continuously contributing to the load here. So that's not good. And there's at Halloween, Carl Rao has posted a picture of a really bad performance problem. I don't know if it was network related, but I thought that was pretty funny. So I tried to imitate his art. And if you then zoom into the weight class other, just wanted to show you that actually sync remote write and redo transport MISC, they're the ones that contribute quite a bit to the load on the system. So what did I learn? Actually, first of all, 100 milliseconds latency is pretty unfair. Actually, it's ridiculous. But it does work. I can throttle network throughputs and all sorts of network aspects in my lab. This is fun. But the performance of my system is greatly impacted. And it means that if you go from asynchronous to synchronous log transfer, just make sure that you've got the low latency network to support this. Otherwise, you may run into trouble. And how can you see the trouble is if you run a comparison. And this is the load profile. The first example the first range of snapshots belongs to my good network. The second one is a bad network. And you can actually see a reduction by 77% in all workload. This includes executes, this includes redo size, logical blocks, and it's just terrible. And also you can see that log file sync in the second AWR report excerpt that I've shown you here is actually taking a lot of time. So I've got an average wait of 159 milliseconds. That is truly not acceptable. Okay, so I think I've got a few more minutes left, and this is also the last topic. And I'm going to show you a change to DBCA on how to create a standby database. So previously, you probably used RMAN to duplicate your standby, well, your target database for standby. But there is an option now in DBCA to do that as well. It's a bit limited at this point in time because it requires you to have a connection with your primary, and in many sites that might not be permissible. But if you can live with the restrictions, there is an example here on how to use create duplicate DB, which is the new option. So you can just run DBCA and it creates you a standby database. And when I last looked at it, it really did the duplicate database from active database. So this is part of the log file in the DBCA log file where you can see what it did. And this is just a bog standard, it's a dummy database. So I haven't really tested it with anything more complex. But yeah, if a duplicate target database for standby from active database works outside of this tool, there's probably good reason to believe that this works for the other tool. Just be careful about the do recover and no file name check options here. So that might potentially be dangerous. But again, if you can live with these restrictions, that might be something for you. The thing to look after, though, is it doesn't clean up. So DBCA created a new listener. It did so in the RDBMS home, even if grid infrastructure was present. And you can see two listeners here in my system when I did the test, and it created a listener aura file for this listener. And I think it's just listener, and then it's a timestamp. So that's the listener name, and it just finds a free port and does the work. So it doesn't do everything right, but it does a lot of good stuff. And especially for my lab, this is a really, really good way of creating databases. It registers the database in clusterware. It puts the SP file and password file into ASM, so I don't have to do it. But you still have to change the database role, and the start options could be wrong depending on how you're licensed. But you can use Ansible or something else to fix this, and it's actually not too difficult to do. And I've been doing this a lot using my playbooks. Okay, so I apologize once more for the technical difficulties at the beginning. I hope the audio quality was reasonable by now. I want to get to the summary of my presentation, and this is essentially to say DataGuard is pretty awesome. It's one of the technologies I take to a lone island together maybe with partitioning and the diagnostics and diagnostics and tuning pack. Like I said at the beginning, it can be slightly uncomfortable using DataGuards, but it's been pretty solid whenever I used it. If your configuration is right, it can do you a lot of good. So having said that, I'm going to now go over the Q&A questions. Let me see if I can get this to stop sharing and go into the Q&A. Why do we need, so I'm going to go through the list of questions now. One of the questions was, why do we need one extra redo log for standby? Well, there are two answers. The short answer is because Oracle documented it that way. My speculation, and I don't really know for sure, is that it gives the database another archive standby redo log to receive redo from in case of high redo throughput applications. So that's why I think you need it for. And if you don't have an extra standby redo log compared to the number of groups per thread, it will be flagged not only by DataGuard Broker, but also by OraCheck. So it's definitely something you should be doing. Validate network command is available since 18C. Yes, I believe so. I would have to check the docs, but I think I did this initially on a 18C database, so it should be there in 18C. Someone else has something that's more of a hint rather than a question. What is not yet included in the broker validate command is in which state the pluggables on the standby are. Oh, yes, good point. Good point. My demos and my slides here, they have mentioned non-CDBs. That is okay, because I didn't want to make it too complicated. On the other hand, as we all know, the non-CDB architecture has been deprecated and it eventually will go away. So yes, true, we would love to see more support for that, but I haven't had the chance to look at the 20C database yet, so I don't know what it is. So I'm not sure. Well, I really would hope that Oracle does add some support in there. Yeah, I fully agree with you. So what else do we have in terms of questions? Can you help with a good description of how to set up DataGuard Broker 412C? Yes. There are lots of blog posts out there on how to set the broker up for 12.1. But honestly, I think the Oracle documentation for DataGuard is some of the best out there is. So I would really encourage you to always look at the Oracle documentation first and see how they do things before I'm going to start off venturing off into the depth of the internet, because as somebody has said to me famously, it's just because it's written doesn't mean it's right. So I'd always go for the official documentation. And like I said, the DataGuard Broker Concepts and Administration Guide is very decent. So I hope I answered that. There is another question. Let me check. Is there any command in DG Broker to validate sys password in primary and standby database? I don't believe there is. However, it does so implicitly. So when you do the network validation itself, like I said, it connects from the database you connected to the standby, then it connects from the standby to the primary. And if you had problems with your authentication layer, whether you're using the sys password or something else, then it would tell you at that point. It would tell you it can't connect. So that should probably do the thing. Okay, so we're now 10 past. Gianni, what's the plan? Do we give 10 minutes to Ilma for continuing, or do we still have time for questions?
You still have 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay, cool. So let me see. What else? There is someone who's put a rather lengthy question. Let me see if I can find something in the chat that I can answer instead. Okay. Well, essentially people commenting on my poor audio experience from earlier. Like I said, I'm really sorry about that. Any improvement for rack on rack setup in 18C? Well, yes. 18C, is it 18C or is it 19? I do remember that there is an enhancement of multi-instance redo apply in rack, but I'm now not sure if that came in 18 or 19 or even before. But that's the one thing that really sticks out to me. So in high redo scenarios, you can have cases where your rack DataGuard instance, there's only one apply instance. When it runs into trouble, applying all the redo that comes in, and with multi-instance redo apply, you can mitigate against that. And obviously there is a lot more stuff to DataGuard than I have covered, which has come in new with the 12.2, 18C, and 19C releases, like the delayed, that DML redirection and more and more support for running reporting workloads on a physical standby. But most of those require active DataGuard, so I haven't really covered those in much detail. I was debating with myself whether I should be showing you the impact of synchronous redo transport based on ASH, because it requires obviously Enterprise Edition plus Diagnostics Pack. But I thought it's a good visualization of the problem that you can face when you run synchronous redo transport over very long distances, and it's just not viable for many systems. Okay, let me check the Q&A again, see if there is anybody who's answered. We need more questions. There is one question here that came in. Can I restore specific corrupted block in data guard environments, not necessarily no logging? What if I accidentally deleted a data file on the standby? Can I restore it using data guard broker? No, you can't use the broker, but what you can check, and I don't have enough time to explain this in detail, but you can look at the restore from service in the RMAN documentation. So there are a few notes there how you can transfer your deleted data file, but it all depends on your situation. So have a look at the restore from service command, because that might be what you want. And I think finally, before I'm going to hand over to Ilma, there is one question. I see most data guard setups without broker in production. Do we have a strong reason for the broker? Oh yes, I would definitely use the broker always, because it allows me to integrate an enterprise manager if I'm licensed for all of this. But the commands are so simple, and they don't change, or they haven't changed with every release. So if I want to switch over to a database, all I need to do is type in switch over to database, and it does everything for me. I don't need to worry about anything. But I really think the simplicity of using the broker is well worth its use. And likewise, if you look at the data guard documentation on how to manually set data guards up, so by using auto system set log archive dest and then log dg config and all of these things that you need to set manually. It's just, create configuration, blah, 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 and then add database, and enable configuration, you're done. The only thing you probably should be doing is set the standby file management to auto. And then, well, in most of my cases, I also set log transfer to synchronous and run in max availability. But again, that's a decision you need to make for every system depending on its RTO and RPO. But yeah, that's... I wouldn't go without the broker ever again. I'm just a great fan. And yeah, I think that's me done. So thanks everyone who was staying with me. I didn't see the participant numbers. They probably dropped a bit at the beginning with the audio problems, but thanks everyone of the 90 people who are still connected, who did bear with me, and apologies again for the poor audio quality. And with that, it's back to you, Johnny.